Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the awards talk session. I hope you enjoyed the awards presentations this morning. All the awardees, the 6 awardees, will have about 10 minutes to give a short presentation, and potentially we'll have a chance to have 1 or 2 questions after them if they stay on time. We're going to go in the same order we did this morning, so we would have the service, then art, dissertation, and then the 3 technical awards. So I'm going to introduce Terrence again to present, to introduce our first speaker.
Hi, everybody. I assume most of you have seen the keynote, so heard the long introduction, so I'm going to keep it super brief to allow an extra minute or so for Alan. I'm Terrence Masson. I just want to thank the nomination committee for all of their hard work and express the really incredible role that volunteers play. The Outstanding Service Award Committee has a great pleasure of reviewing people who've really spent many, many decades volunteering both for the organization and the conferences. So as soon as Alan is ready, I'll have him come up. But basically, this year's award winner for the Outstanding Service Award is Dr. Alan Rockwood, who's in his 36-something year, and he's ready. There you go. See, extra minute. Everyone, rock.
Thank you. So when I was thinking about what to say in this talk, I wanted to say something sagacious and wise. Rummaging through the attic of my mind, and found a couple of things. One is the bunch of photographs. This is in fact a Polaroid of perhaps the first computer graphics picture I ever did back in '76. And I didn't even know what SIGGRAPH was, so I presented it at an AMS meeting. Point-based rendering of cusp catastrophe, for those that will recognize that. My thesis advisor at BYU at the time, one Helaman Rolf Pratt Ferguson, got me onto catastrophe theory and thus into computer graphics, actually. So the other thing I found in my attic was a bunch of quotes from people that changed my life. And Helaman, you know, you're like everybody in the middle of my master's thesis. I'm desperate, I'm dismayed, I feel like I haven't, not gonna finish. And I went in to see him and cry on his towel, and he looked at me and said, "Alan, you're better than you know." He didn't help me with my thesis. He didn't give me any, which was what I was hoping he would solve my problem. And I went away, and you know what, I did. I actually solved the problem, got my master's thesis. And even did a little bit of publications in catastrophe theory. That was my first area in mathematics, and did these pictures. Whoops. But these pictures, I did a whole bunch of pictures. They're all point-based pictures. I'm looking at Turner down here. Dusty photographs. And I took these pictures up to Evans and Sutherland, that wasn't far, showed them to Dave Evans, and talked about catastrophe theory to him. And it occurred to me, he sees a lot. He interviewed all the technical people at the time. I thought, how can he possibly judge all this technology? So I asked him, and he looked at me and said, "I judge people, not technology." And I thought, oh, I should have been more nervous. But I got the job. My first job was in flight simulation, and I assert that we produced the first hardware texture system at Evans and Sutherland back in 1982 for flight simulation. That got FAA approval for pilot upgrade training. It was a good time. They then sent me to Cambridge, England to work with Shape Data, a modeling company there. And the first thing that happened is I met Malcolm Sabin, do recursive subdivision. And I worked on an application, we called it Romulus at the time, in recursive subdivision. And the only people that bought that, I think this is significant, is Caterpillar, who were the people that funded the research. No other cells. It was way ahead of its time. It ground to a halt when you did a Boolean through an extraordinary point. But this is my paper in '83 on recursive subdivision. And my boss at that time, one Charles Lang, was a pioneer in solid modeling. And he came by one day to me and said, "It's not what you know, it's who you know." And I actually was shocked at this. I thought, This is a scholar of the first order, and he's saying, it's who you know, and I'm thinking, he's telling me I should get out there and schmooze, which I was never very good at, and get to know people. So we'll come back to this slide in a second. He introduced me to one M.J.D. Powell, who became my PhD supervisor at Cambridge. And I did a thesis in implicit blending and everything, famous mathematician. And his quote was what I saw on the first few papers that I turned into him, in big red letters across the front. And I went actually several years, a very antagonistic relationship. He would just brutalize my papers. And one day, when he was using his term rubbish, I thought, you know, I'm right on this, and he's wrong. And I stood my ground, and he got red, and angry, and fought with me. You do not fight with M.J.D. Powell, Fellow of the Royal Society. And I did. And I thought, well, this might be the end of my PhD. And he looked at me and goes, okay, well, let's move on. And within a week, he said, you know, you've done enough research. You can go home and write it up if you want. And I wrote it up, mailed it to him, got it back, and he had this, pulled out his cover letter, and he said, it's much better than I expected. You had to know the man. I learned a lot from him about standing up, the confidence it takes. Not everybody needs this advice, but perhaps some of you did. You know, I'm better than I knew, and I needed to stand for my stuff. I'm ready for the thesis defense at Cambridge, which did not include the advisor. It's a brutal affair. And that turned into a patent, brought me to point-based rendering again. This is a patent in '83 from Evans and Sutherland on point-based rendering. I loved the stuff. And this led, when I left ENS and went to SGI, to another incident. Jim Clark, and we had my interview for SGI. I don't know what I just did. My interview at SGI, and I'm arguing with Jim Clark about whether it should be point-based or polygon-based. In the middle of the argument, I said, you know, why am I arguing? If you know Jim, he can be pretty opinionated. Why am I arguing with this guy? This is my interview. And at the end of the interview, he just said, oh, by the way, we'd love to have you come work here. So it worked. And I actually did convert to polygons eventually, and I used the work I had done to do parametric surfaces to produce a paper which ended up in OpenGL, the rendering stuff. And years later, I saw this thing, the OpenGL team, and my name is on it. We didn't have an OpenGL team. Pat was putting together a software thing, and we were all just contributing bits and pieces to it. And years later, they talk about the OpenGL team, so that was kind of funny. Another thing I did was image-based modeling ahead of its time. I think this would be classified as my best SIGGRAPH paper that was rejected. Never got published in SIGGRAPH, but it's, you know, take some photographs and create a 3D image from it back in 1989. I then went to Arizona State. It was a very productive period. Lots of good colleagues, and that led to meeting one David Hestonese on the basketball court. He was a very good offensive player, and I prided myself in defense, so we had a lot of headbutting, literally. And then one day I saw that he was giving a talk. I went in, he's giving this talk on geometric algebra, of all things. And so I hooked up and got into geometric algebra with David. I think I was privileged to be included on this paper, which I think may well be one of my most significant papers that I've ever published in mathematics, back to my roots. That led, Turner was the paper chair ahead of me, to being paper chair in '99. That led to being conference chair in 2003. I had if you remember, that was a disastrous year financially after 9/11. I had the greatest, and I have to say thank you to my committee there. They did it. The one thing I did well in 2003 was pick a great committee. That led to a whole bunch of SIGGRAPH volunteering. I think that's mainly why I got this award. Won't go into detail. SIGGRAPH Asia Papers Chair. Some other photos, I had time at the School of Mines, at Mitsubishi, and in Saudi Arabia. Did various things there, including optimization and convex. And very recently, the stuff I did in Saudi Arabia led to a startup. Come to my booth in the exhibits floor, in the startup garage, and we can talk more about these things. So, going back to Charles. I've realized now, after all these years, and I'm old and sagacious, what Charles told me is not go out and schmooze and get to know people. It's the people in your life who changed your life, like the ones that I just presented, and so many more of you, and I apologize for not getting there. So it is the people that I knew, and not so much what I knew. So go out, you young people, and find people who will change your life, who will challenge you, who will get you to grow. And that's the sort of thing that I found in my attic the other day. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Sue Golliver. I'm chair of the Digital Arts Award, and this year has been for his significance in digital art to Ernest Edmonds, and he's going to talk about his great career, both as an academic, an artist, a long-time supporter of SIGGRAPH, and a researcher as well. So I'm really looking forward to his talk. Thank you.
So it's not a requirement to understand the technology to get one of these awards, apparently. In my brief survey of a few things that I've done, I want, first of all, to thank everyone, and secondly, to say that whilst I've been listening to our first presentation, I've been rummaging in my loft, and I found a quote there that I want to share with you. The quote comes from a guy called Brian Oakley. Brian Oakley used to run a program of research in the UK called the Alvey program, which, for those of you who are old enough, was the British reaction to the fifth generation program, and it was a big financial investment into computing research in the UK. And my quote from Brian is, "So what?" And whenever I do anything now, I always think of Brian's question, "So what?" Maybe I can give you a little hint about "so what" in my short presentation to you now. 50 years ago this year, apart from painting paintings, I was also writing concrete poems. Concrete poems are words turned into graphics with structure. And that, in a way, was the starting point of the adventure that followed. The very following year, I made this artwork that's on the screen now, which was the first time I used a computer program in my art. And very briefly, I went on to do lots of other things. That's the bit of the program I used. There's a young man who was making this work. And I worked with colleagues, often collaborating, looking at computers and thinking, having used a computer in an artwork, well, what does all this go to mean for art? And in a computer graphics conference held in the UK in 1970, which was pretty early for computer graphics conferences, I think, we presented this paper where we said mostly the importance of computing for art was in interaction. And we produced various models of what interactive art might work like. And then we used advanced technology like teletypes and graph plotters and things to try to produce interactive art. It was pretty difficult. And we used paper tape and so on and so forth. And then I started to think about, well, interaction, if you look at interaction more broadly, it's not just between one thing and another. There is a community. We communicate amongst groups of people. And so I started to make artworks. This is, again, is the early 1970s. I called them communications games, where I was looking at making art out of the communications between human beings through the technology. Not using computers, but I designed logic circuits and used soldering irons to build them, and so on. And then moving forward to the 80s, by the middle of the 80s, 1985, I've been working for 5 years, and in that year, first exhibited computer-generated video works. And I'll show you a little bit of this just while I talk. There's something I want to particularly draw to your attention. This year is an anniversary, a very important anniversary in the area of biology as it has influenced art. 100 years ago this year, a guy called Darcy Thompson published a book called On Growth and Form. It was a book about mathematics and how mathematical structures can be seen in nature, both enabling, underpinning, and constraining growth. And when you look at plants, insects, people, communities, forests, flocks of birds, you can understand them very well by looking at the underpinning mathematics. To many people, this was the most important book apart from Darwin's Origin of the Species, which existed for many, many years. Not until DNA did people think that there was something more important. So this book was very important in biology, but it was a great influence on many artists who saw this mathematics in nature, mathematics underpinning nature, as something that they could deal with in metaphorical terms in art, so that the mathematics underpinning the art would metaphorically be something as is done in nature. And it became generative art. So that's what I did. I started making generative art. I'm deeply interested, I've always been deeply interested in color, but when I started doing it, as you see here, I didn't use color. And that's because in the early 1980s, color was so unreliable on computers in any way, shape, or form that the safest thing to do was not to use it. I went forward and did many things looking at communications again. So I made works like this was a work which had one part in Sydney in Australia and another part in Belfast in the UK, and these two parts were one artwork. People interacted with each part, and the two parts interacted with one another by the 1990s, and later, of course, we could use the internet instead of soldering irons and pieces of wire. And I started to look at color in the street, in big squares, and also on small squares on walls. Growth and form, including distributed communities. So the growth and the form that made the community into an artwork was at the center of my concern. So all of this work, simple as it might be on the surface, is complex underneath the surface. Like many simple things in life, simple, beautiful things of life, they come about through very complex processes. So it is with much art, not just my art, but many works of art by people who work in the same tradition that I work in. And these complex processes, again, can be used in a distributed way. So here's another work. This one was done collaboratively with another artist called Sean Clark, where we were communicating between different locations, taking images from those locations, and imposing above and on those images color sequences that intrigued and helped to communicate in unspecified ways. Communication in its very basic form. And to come to one of the central points that I want to discuss in relation to growth and form in my art and my kind of art, I'll show you something about an installation piece of mine called Shaping Space. It's an installation piece, an interactive piece in a room. I'll run this little movie while I just explain a few things. First of all, let me talk about color here. The important thing is generative color, looking at the mathematics underneath the color, so that in works such as this, and such as the small screens that I showed you on an earlier slide, I'm looking at how color is formed, how color relationships are formed, how close one color can be to another from a mathematical point of view, and building that mathematics into computer programs so that it is controlled and generated in a way which is hopefully beautiful, certainly intriguing, and definitely art. So using Darcy Thompson's notions of life, dealing with color in the same way. Second point about this work is another one of my works which uses open systems, systems which interact with the world around them. Some artists doing the kind of work that I do use random numbers or pseudo-random numbers, which of course aren't random at all, and I don't use anything like that. All of my stuff is completely deterministic, as nature is, but it is unpredictable because it's not deterministic, because it's open, because it interchanges with the world. And we never know and can't predict what those changes might be and how those changes might influence the development of the future of the work. And I've developed an idea beyond where I started. So around about 1970, I was talking about interaction. I've moved away from the notion of interaction because interaction seems too simple. And if I use a quote, if you've heard me talk about this before, you'll have heard this before because it's my favorite way of explaining it. When I interact with my grandchildren, you have one of them on the screen there interacting with one of my works. When I interact with one of my grandchildren, I love it that we get immediate feedback, that there is interaction. But more important is that I hope that over time, the fact that we have that interaction will influence my grandchild in a way that makes them different in 5 or 10 years' time. So I'm trying to deal with that kind of notion in my art. So I call it not interaction, but influence. So works of art that change over long periods of time, months and years, according to the experiences that the artwork has. So this is growth and form over life, not just in a short period of time and not just to produce a static object, but to produce life and growth in art. So it's all done from rules and constraints like life itself. So here are a few shots from a recent exhibition at Microsoft Research in Beijing, where, not to talk about these images in particular, but to say that this exhibition was about these notions: generative art, interactive art, influencing the future, using VR, using AR, distributed art, connected art, attacking the issues of growth and form as were represented in this really important book of 100 years ago, but in the forms that we can understand it and look at it from now and into the future. And just to conclude, I've said very little. There's no time to say more. If you want to know more, Francesca Franco is publishing this book about my work any day now, called Generative Systems Art. It's a book that works through the history of what I've done. And I think rather coincidentally and nicely, she is curating an exhibition to be opened in October this year in Venice, showing 5 artists who were pioneers, as I'm proud to call myself, of computer-based art together in Venice. And the nice thing, the nice coincidence, is that 3 of them will be people who've received this award from SIGGRAPH. So thank you very much.
This year's dissertation awards went to Eric Heide, and he will be telling you a little bit about his dissertation, I hope, a little more than we got this morning. So, Eric.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Imaging and vision systems excuse me, surround us in our daily lives. Use these systems in our personal devices to communicate with each other, like as enabling technologies allowing for new scientific discoveries, and soon they'll allow autonomous agents to sense the world and act independently. So to start off my talk, I'd like to look at an imaging scenario that we all encounter with our smartphones, cell phones. In low light, our smartphones acquire images which are heavily degraded by noise, such as the image shown here on the right side. And while we as humans can very quickly classify this image as an espresso, unfortunately a state-of-the-art, very deep neural architecture, unfortunately severely misclassifies this image. And at the same time, also a state-of-the-art denoising approach, which produces an image which is perceptually very pleasing. Noise is reduced significantly, unfortunately still is severely misclassified. So this shows us that our human visual system is extremely robust, allows for very robust learning, very fast inference in contrast to existing higher level vision architectures, which still require a lot of work. At the same time, there's evolutionary limits placed on our human visual system. For example, we cannot easily see through fog, see in scattering media, and we cannot easily image objects which are outside the direct line of sight, both capabilities which would be extremely useful in everyday tasks. So my research explores computational imaging and vision systems that use algorithms to provide robustness to imaging and vision, that attempt to radically simplify existing camera systems, and that allow for what I would call superhuman vision, that allow us to see through scattering media and see objects outside the direct line of sight. So this exciting new research area is making up most of my thesis, is at the intersection where graphics intersects with optics and sensors, with computer vision, with optimization and machine learning. So to give a first example where computational imaging can add robustness in existing camera systems, let's look at traditional color imaging systems, and in particular ways how we can rethink the processing in these camera systems. Modern color imaging systems are becoming increasingly diverse. We have burst capture protocols, moving improved low-light performance into our smartphone, cell phones. Novel camera designs such as Light's array camera are appearing on the market, and novel sensor designs, especially HDR sensor design in robotics, are moving heavily, for example, in the autonomous vision space. At the same time, embedded imaging and vision processors are rapidly moving into mobile devices. So we have much more computational power now at our leverage. However, traditional image processing pipelines haven't changed all too much over the last decades. The measurements that we acquire at the sensor are degraded by various aspects in the capture process. We have noise in the signal itself, such as photon shot noise, noise introduced in the readout, and subsampling introduced, for example, on a color filter array. And we've been building pipelines where we solve the image reconstruction task of reconstructing a high-quality image from these degraded measurements by building pipelines where each block solves an individual sub-problem. For example, in this case, denoising, the removal of noise, lens correction, and so forth. So this pipeline approach, while interesting from an engineering point of view, unfortunately has a severe downside. So each of these steps discard the input to the respective step right after they're done processing, and therefore error can accumulate in those pipelines. And they're not very flexible. So for each of these camera systems I've shown you here at the bottom, we have to design a completely new pipeline system specifically tailored for this camera system. So in the line of work, we've been exploring a very different approach to image processing that is based on an optimization-based approach, which takes two sets of inputs. First input is a probabilistic model of the image formation model, which consists of a noise model, a model for the subsampling and color filter array, and a model for the aberrations. The second part is priors. Following a Bayesian model, we can leverage prior statistical knowledge of images that previously have been explored in denoising approaches, as well we can learn priors from large data sets of images. So for all of these camera systems I've shown here at the bottom, in order to build an efficient image processing pipeline, all what we have to do is change the image formation model. Everything else can stay as it is. So let's look at an example of how we can use this approach to imaging. In low light, our smartphones, cell phones do not simply acquire a very long exposure because it would lead to motion blur. But what state-of-the-art low-light denoising architectures do is they take, in fact, a burst of ultra-short exposures, which then each of them are heavily degraded by noise and they're misaligned. So what these approaches then do, and a pipeline approach, is to demosaic these images, align them to a reference frame, accumulate those images, and then do some post-processing denoising. And here's the result of such a pipeline approach. And now we can, in fact, do substantially better by solving all of these individual sub-problems rather than a pipeline approach and one joint optimization-based approach by solving alignment, denoising, and demosaicing jointly together at a higher computational cost, though, to be fair. However, we can maybe afford this higher computational cost given these accelerator architectures. Another problem that appears very early on in low-level vision is demosaicing. Demosaicing is the recovery of missing color information that has been subsampled on a Bayer color filter array. So given such a ground truth image, we can extract a measurement, subsample color information, and now we can in-paint the missing color information on the pixels that don't have the respective color filters. And a tool for photography, Adobe's Camera Raw, gives us an image which suffers from severe artifacts around fine features and around edges. And it's not better using a recent patch-based algorithm, which is extremely expensive. We can do substantially better with just a tiny little change in our image formation model using the same architecture that I mentioned before and achieve, interestingly, results that are almost 2 decibels better in terms of PSNR than approaches that have been presented over the last decades, which is an exciting result. We can also use the same idea to add robustness to existing vision systems. And rather than designing a pipeline approach where we use a traditional ISP, a traditional hardware block pipeline, would take the images, JPEG images, pipe them into a high-level vision model, we can design both of these approaches together in an end-to-end approach. We take our optimization-based approach, unroll it for a few iterations, make certain parameters, the priors, tunable, and train the model end-to-end. And interestingly, in comparison to retrained models from the same data, we're able to do substantially better, almost 10% better in extreme low light scenarios, allowing us to classify fairly extreme cases where the retrained, fine-tuned model on the same images does not produce the correct classification. So in the future, hopefully, architectures like this will add radical robustness to vision systems that are exciting out in the world. Another research area that can be tackled with computational imaging is how we can make our devices simpler. And one of the areas that I've been exploring is how we, in particular, can rethink optics, how we can build thin optics using computation. Optics are designed to achieve a one-to-one transfer function from incident angles of light to sensor readings. Unfortunately, simple single lens elements severely deviate from this idealized behavior. And one of those deviations is axial chromatic aberration, a change of focus based on the wavelength. And so we've been building, over a very long time, pipelines of optical elements. We've been building compound lenses that account for the aberrations of a single simple element by just introducing more lens elements. So this makes our existing optics expensive, large, and heavy. In another work, we were wondering, okay, how far can we push this? How far can we simplify existing lens systems by adding computation to account for the aberrations after the fact in computation? And here's the result using very similar optimization-based image reconstruction method that I mentioned before. So we can recover a lot of the detail, can remove a lot of the chromatic aberration from severely degraded images, in this case here taken with a single plano-convex lens that I showed you on the previous slide. But by simplifying a compound lens system to a single plano-convex lens, what I've also done is I've turned my tunable lens system, which has, for example, focus tunability by moving lens elements back and forth in the optical stack, into a system that's not really tunable anymore. I would still have to move the element back and forth to change the focus, and therefore making it bigger. So we're wondering, can we build an ultra-thin lens system that is still thin and allows for variable optical parameters? And we did it by designing a stack of two diffractive optical elements. We put phase functions that we designed using matrix factorization that, when rotated, give us different focus levels. We've manufactured them on ultra-thin slabs of glass using photolithography, and the results in combination with optimization after the fact are fairly good. So here we see, just by rotating, a change of focus with our ultra-thin optical system. Here's another example where we have a fairly extreme case, a screw placed around 10 millimeters in front of our lens system, and just by rotating, we can change the focus fairly extremely. We have also additional results about how we can implement zoom with this system in the paper. Finally, in the very last part of my talk, I'd like to talk about how computational imaging can enable completely new imaging modalities. In particular, one that I'm interested in a lot is imaging at relativistic speeds. If you look at the conventional capture shown on the right side here, then this capture, let's assume it has been acquired with a single camera, a single light source, has been acquired by accumulating all the photons of travel time that have travel times which fall in the exposure interval. So now if we were to emit an ultra-short pulse of light into the scene and capture the scene at a very high temporal resolution, then what we would observe is the image shown here on the right side. It's essentially a video. It's light propagating through the scene at the speed of light. And essentially what we would capture here is the temporal impulse response of light transport in the scene. It's very exciting to think about capturing temporal impulse response of light transport and capturing those, because light transport itself is a linear time invariant system. So in fact, it's fully characterized by its temporal impulse response. Next, I show you how we can capture such images and what application of such images were. Ramesh Araska, who was giving a talk, I think 2 steps after me, has built an exciting new system that uses a femtosecond laser and a streak camera to directly acquire those images. So these guys were the pioneers in acquiring those what we call in the graphics community transient images. Very high resolution, high temporal, high spatial resolution images. But unfortunately, by directly acquiring those images with a femtosecond laser and a streak camera, the resulting system is very light inefficient, so it requires hours of acquisition time. Is very importable and inflexible to use. And by using computation, we've been able to acquire these images. In fact, the capture that I've shown you on the previous slide, just with a modified, simple time-of-flight camera. We're using an array of laser diodes that we show custom modulation codes on, together with computation after the fact to extract those, this new temporal dimension of light in a post-processing process. That has allowed us to achieve orders of magnitude in reduction in the acquisition time, and drastically reduced power and robustness against ambient illumination. And one of the applications of this new temporal dimension of light is that it can, to a certain extent, allow for imaging in scattering media. In scattering media, let's look at the image that is shown here on the left side. We have a water tank filled with milky water and some objects submerged in this water tank. Now, a conventional capture, as the one that is shown here on this slide, doesn't reveal the objects in the water tank. And this is because scattered light paths are superimposed with paths of ballistic photons that are undisturbed. So now, by capturing images of this additional temporal dimension of light, we can, to a certain extent, unmix mixed path components in scattering media. So in the bottom right, we can see the transient image acquired with our simple time-of-flight camera in this scene. You can see that objects like the plate or the object hanging from the top of the water tank are visible again. Finally, a very exciting application is that we can, again, use this additional temporal dimension of light transport to capture objects outside the direct line of sight in a setup as the one that I'm showing you here. We assume that we have a camera looking at a diffuse planar object here in the scene, and then we send a pulse of laser light onto a single spot on the wall. This light will now, assuming that the wall is diffuse, bounce outside the direct line of sight of the camera, bounce back to the wall and back to the camera. And from the temporally resolved indirect reflections, we can now recover objects outside the direct line of sight. And here's an example in a setup where I've shown you the dimensions of this setup on the left side. And for the scene consisting of two simple reflectors shown here on the right side, we can in fact, using computation, recover these objects in fairly large, almost room-sized scenes accurately using our simple modified time-of-flight camera. So in summary, I've shown you computational imaging and vision systems that use algorithms to provide robustness to imaging and vision systems, that attempt to radically simplify camera systems, and that allow, to a certain extent, for superhuman vision. And none of this work would really have been possible without all my amazing collaborators. And here's just a short list of some of the few people that I'd like to recognize.
We'll move on to the three technical awards. First one is a significant new researcher award, which went this year to Bernd Pickel. If you were paying attention, you'll notice that he is the second winner in a row from IST in Austria. The game is not rigged, I can assure you. And I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say.
Thanks everybody for coming. It's a real honor for me to be here. Yes, there is no guideline for these type of talks, but actually many of the previous award talks were centered around the theme of how to pick a good research topic in computer graphics. And these talks are actually really inspiring to me as a student. And I would like to use this opportunity actually to show you how some of this advice has helped me in the context of the research direction I'm excited about now for already quite some time, namely computational fabrication. So as we all know, digital fabrication devices such as 3D printers, robotic arms, and milling machines provide extremely exciting possibilities to fabricate complex objects. For example, multi-material printers allow the control and combination of multiple materials at a level that was absolutely out of reach so far. And robotic fabrication might fundamentally change how we think about architecture and building houses in the future, just to name some examples. Now, from my point of view, as someone working in computer graphics, digital fabrication is exciting because it enables the seamless combination of digital design with physical construction processes. I got excited about this area in 2009 when I started working on a 3D hard copy machine for deformable objects. So the vision was that we want to come up with a system that allows to 3D scan and probe a deformable object, as for example shown in the form of a flip-flop on the left, and then approximate the object and its deformation behavior with a material structure that can be reproduced by a 3D printer, such that we finally obtain a real-world replica of the object as shown on the right-hand side. Now this concept is really interesting as it closed the loop from going from the real world to the virtual world, and again then back from the virtual world to the real world. However, when we worked on this topic, actually several colleagues were asking, is this graphics? Or should this work rather go to a mechanical engineering venue as it deals with continuum mechanics and the reproduction of material behavior? Luckily, actually right at the time, in 2009, Michael Cass gave an award speech where he pointed out that some of his most influential work was initially actually controversial and barely made it into SIGGRAPH because back in the days it was considered at the edge of graphics, such as, for example, using control theory for character animation or fluid dynamics, topics that we nowadays clearly would classify as core graphics. So instead of rigidly defining the field, he was arguing that graphics is what we define through the process of how SIGGRAPH selects and solicits material. And this is an ongoing process where we actually collectively decide what we want to include and what we want to encourage. And this actually changed my perspective. So instead of coming up with projects based on the definition of the field, another approach is to ask the question, where are one's strengths, and then try to identify interesting open research problems that can be addressed by them. Now, this is my personal biased view, but clearly I think all of you will agree that the core expertise of our community are mathematical representations and efficient algorithms for processing shapes and their appearance, but also robust and fast simulation approaches for a wide range of phenomena, ranging from light transport to sound, deformable bodies, and fluids. Furthermore, our community is proficient in developing interactive techniques that keep the user in the loop and thereby providing ways for the user to accomplish a task. Also, in the last years, we have seen amazing progress of devices, both input devices, for example, sensors that allow to capture and measure geometry, appearance, and motion, but also new output devices ranging from displays to 3D printers. And tightly integrating them was actually the key that helped us making huge progress in realism and generating images, videos, and 3D content of unseen quality. However, these ingredients are also key to solve a huge range of other scientific and applied problems, which are waiting to be addressed and also provide, I think, a big chance for our community to grow. Now, in the following, I want to focus on one example that already gained some attention, which is computational fabrication. So combining digital design with physical construction processes brings an interesting change in workflow, which I think is nicely illustrated here in this cover from The Economist. So it opens the door to personalized fabrication that happens literally on your desk, bringing closely together user, computation, and output device. And this also means that the consumer is going to be much more closely involved in the process and that we need tools for modeling content. Now, making significant progress, I think, requires a holistic view on the problem, integrating algorithms, interaction, and the capabilities of the output device into the design process. And in the following, I will show you a few of our recent projects, and for each of them, I will emphasize one of these aspects. Let's start with interaction. So Milena Skouras, one of my PhD students and collaborators at Disney Research, was actually lead author on a paper that targeted developing a design system for inflatable structures, as shown on this picture. And designing inflatable structures requires actually solving a complicated patterning problem. So what is the shape of the flat panels that we must cut, and how do we need to interconnect these panels such that the final assembly actually inflates to the desired 3D shape? Now this task is extremely challenging since the designer must anticipate and invert the effect of pressure on the shape of the structure, while also simultaneously taking into account the aesthetics of the seams. So to address this problem, she developed an optimization in the loop methodology. Starting from a 3D shape, the designer sketches the proposed placement of seams, and then the underlying optimizer reverse engineers the physics of inflation, providing a set of panels that best accommodate the desired seams and target shape. And the contribution here, I think, clearly went far beyond the user interface and actually required the development of an approximate but still accurate underlying model to achieve the necessary speed for interactive exploration of different seam layouts and also their effects on the inflated shape. Similarly in spirit, my student Ran Chang worked on an interactive design system to create functional mechanical object based on the concept of retargeting of an existing mechanical template, for example, this drivetrain, to a user-specified input shape, for example, the shape of this pickup truck. And while the user here can provide high-level inputs, such as placing some components or interactively editing the shape of the pickup truck, an optimization in the loop approach makes sure that a valid configuration of the mechanism and the shape is found such that the output is actually functional, it's a functional mechanical object that can be 3D printed, and also used in real life as shown here. Now, while in these cases, so far the user actually has a leading role in the exploration of the design space, in other design spaces are, due to their complexity, actually out of reach for being explored manually. And one example are metamaterials. So metamaterials, in the broadest sense, are structured materials whose properties are not only governed by the base material, but also by its small-scale microstructure. So if we, for example, introduce such a lattice microstructure, we can alter the elasticity of the object without having to use different materials. And the challenge we are facing now is how to efficiently map high-level descriptions of material behavior to such microstructures, and how to very efficiently synthesize these structures so that they can be printed. As for example, for this Armadillo model, which has color-coded different stiffnesses assigned to its volume. Now, addressing this issue in 2015, Christian Schumacher presented a data-driven method for very efficiently synthesizing the corresponding spatially varying microstructures that mimic the desired behavior and which can also are guaranteed to be 3D printable. And here you see a printout in this video. Now, going even a step further by slightly manipulating standard fabrication processes, one can come up with very new concepts for fabrication. In this project, my student Ruslan Gusenov developed a method that allows fabrication of self-transforming structures, in this case curvy shells that form from an initially flat state. So the idea is that they consist of small rigid tiles that are tightly held together by two pre-stretched elastic sheets attached to them, and then once released, the restoring forces of these pre-stretched sheets support the object to take shape in 3D, as shown for the model here on the right-hand side, for example. Or in this video, where a mask takes shape from a flat configuration. And the vision here of this work is that it should enable the combination of very powerful existing 2D fabrication techniques, such as, for example, maybe you can think of screen printing or any other 2D process, and then actually lift the results to 3D. And the technical challenge here was to come up with a mechanism that can be easily fabricated, but also to come up with a computational method that can generate a tile layout in 2D and optimize the distribution and shape of these tiles to actually obtain a configuration that is fabricatable and also takes the desired 3D shape. Now, taking a step back, I have shown you several examples that highlight that new computational methods are key to generate models that extend, and also key to use actually the full capabilities of digital fabrication devices. and that they're also necessary to make fabrication more accessible to general users. And competences in interactive techniques in developing efficient representation and algorithms, as well as novel input and output devices, will allow actually our community to play a leading role in this area. However, of course, computational fabrication is interdisciplinary with interfaces to many disciplines, as for example, material science, applied math, robotics, HCI, mechanical engineering, or perception, just to name a few. And one exciting challenge will be actually how to create synergies between these fields to make sure that we actually inspire creative solutions that shape the future and also maximize impact. With this, I finally also want to use this opportunity to quickly reiterate how thankful I am to the people who have mentored me, especially my PhD advisor, Markus Groß, and my advisor during my postdoc at Disney, Wojtek Matusik, who are both wonderful people and great mentors and who have introduced me to SIGGRAPH and the world of graphics. I also want to thank my group members and colleagues at IST Austria. I was extremely lucky to be able to work with many great collaborators. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to name all of them, but I want to say thanks to two very special collaborators that I actually both met as students and co-supervised actually their master's thesis and then became close friends. Thabo Behler, with whom I collaborated on several facial capture projects, and Moritz Becher, with whom I worked on several exciting computational fabrication papers. And finally, I also want to thank you, the community, for providing such an inspiring environment, and also my family for all their support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Björn. Our next speaker is Ramesh Raskar, who's this year's winner of the Achievement Award. And Ramesh, you want to come on up? As I mentioned earlier, I've known Ramesh for many years and I'm quite interested to hear what he has to say today.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. As I said earlier, I think I'm delighted to see social impact through graphics techniques mentioned in the citation. And I want to kind of dig a little bit deeper on what we mean by impact. I think all of us go through 4 stages in life. In the beginning, we learn in a sandbox. When we're young, then we start to apply, we invent, innovate, bring new hammers. Then over time, we want to have an impact in areas beyond the area in which we started. And eventually, many of us, when we're senior enough, think about activism, where we want other people to also think like us. How does this relate to SIGGRAPH? So I feel like over the last 30 or 40 years, SIGGRAPH has done an amazing job of influencing and latching onto some multi-billion-dollar industries through the hammers that we know really well. And our hammers have been geometry, rendering, animation, imaging, and so on. And that has created, just fantastic impact on fields like CAD/CAM and vehicle, auto industry, movies, games, photography, and so on. And now the question is, what's the 5th element that's going to emerge over time? And when I have a lot of discussion with Don Greenberg and Turner Wittert about where could SIGGRAPH go, late night conversations, and also I was in the SIGGRAPH executive committee for the previous 3 years. And I know everybody's thinking about this issue of what does it mean to have an impact beyond the original sandbox we had for movies and games and entertainment. So let's look at this a little bit, right? So we're looking for the 5th element. We got the geometry, rendering, animation, and imaging. Is it going to be a grain or a grail, or we'll see how that holy grail plays out. In the sandbox, we figured out, just like a startup, we want to be very focused and take movies and entertainment as a beachhead problem, which is very lucrative, very influential, changes people's lives, and use that for many things. And if you go back and look at some of the pioneers in the field and how they have challenged us, if you go back and look at Evan Sutherland's talk from 60s and 70s, he talks a lot about being in this learn cycle, about the geometry, about the animation, rendering, and so on. And as I said, the second phase of our lives, just like SIGGRAPH in second phase, is about apply. We invent, innovate, we bring in all kinds of new hammers, machine learning, signal processing, optics, graph cuts, audio, whatever hammers we can find, but we continue to apply them to the sandbox that we like. And then others can take those ideas and apply them to manufacturing and arts and whatever they want, but we stay in our sandbox. In fact, when we write our papers, there's a question for reviewers that says, does this work contribute to SIGGRAPH techniques? And by that, we mean to that sandbox where we play. And maybe we are reaching a third phase where we start caring about impact. And maybe the question for reviewers should be, does this work, does this paper contribute SIGGRAPH technique to a new impactful area? Right? And I think we can do that because only by playing outside the sandbox, we might actually stimulate even more research, even more areas, and you saw some flavor of that in the talks before this. And funnily enough, when Jim Blinn gave his talk in '98 on kind of top 10 challenges, it's one of my favorite talks, everyone should go see it. He described various challenges on rendering spaghetti and so on, but the 10th one was very telling. The 10th one, if you read his ICCC GNA article, he says the 10th one is, I wonder if we will ever find a good application for 3D graphics that's really compelling. And kind of interesting to see that coming from an amazing person like Jim Blinn. So before I go on and talk about what I think is SIGGRAPH plus impact, I want to, of course, thank my PhD co-advisors, Henry Fuchs and Greg Welch, and all my collaborators, especially those at Chapel Hill and Merle and Media Lab and currently at Facebook, where I'm doing my sabbatical, and a lot of co-authors in multiple countries. And it's amazing how many of these people have spent their New Year's Eve and Christmas break with me. In fact, I have a tradition where I take my team on 25th December evening for dinner, because many of them are international, and even those in the US are spending their time with us. And that's been going on for the last 20 years. But unfortunately, I had to break that tradition last year because I was on sabbatical. So I hope to get back to that tradition, or maybe the deadlines will shift. So I really want to thank all of them, and this award really goes out to them. So talking about new and emerging areas, of course, we are very proud of VR, AR, displays, cameras, fabrication, and these are new areas. Some of them, of course, are coming back after 20 years. But there are also emerging areas, which are slightly outside our sandbox in health and materials and food and so on. And I think the question that really gets me excited about SIGGRAPH is how SIGGRAPH is going to solve the next amazing problems with tools of visual computing. That's what gets me going. So if I think about kind of harvesting energy with tidal waves, one of the problems with these eddy currents is that they're extremely high dynamic range, and they can rip the blades. So there's a major effort going on in energy industry of how do you design these blades that are robust enough but still will survive given the viscosity and the dynamic range of these eddy currents, right? So we don't think about energy as a sandbox for us. Think about indoor farming, hydroponics. My colleague Masahiko Konami likes to call this VR for plants. And what we need to do here is be able to simulate. We have done a great job at SIGGRAPH on thinking about either photorealistic or physically valid rendering. But the rest of the world also requires biochemical or genomics, or take your favorite field, at neuronal level simulation of the world. So we need to make things realistic and valid with those fundamental properties as well. Because although the final output may still be visual, the techniques require us to go in these other areas to make them physically valid, biochemically valid, and so on. So when it comes to food, it's actually a lot about the parameters we already understand. It's about the wind, it's about the light, it's about the fertilizers, and so on. It's all about, we know the proceduralization of various mechanisms, and that's what plants and food require. And at the same time, the modeling techniques, some of them we heard this morning, are useful as well if you want to do a machine learning, a statistical model of having a very controlled setting of lighting and wind and so on. We can create that in the box, but use that model for everything else, because food is very, very important. My colleague and friend, Neri Oxman at Media Lab, is constantly thinking about how can we create hydroporous building materials so that we can get rid of air conditioning and heating. Again, a very important energy problem. This is a classic technique that could use highly sophisticated SIGGRAPH methods. The same methods that we use for animation and rendering for entertainment and games. And when it comes to fabrication, we heard a couple of ideas before. If you want to create materials that are hydrophobic, hydrophilic, and so on, almost all of that boils down to microstructures. And I know we went from kind of Phong shading to Garrod shading. It took us a long time to start thinking about microfacets. And I think it's the same thing here. Right now we're thinking at mesoscales when we do most of this work at millimeter or centimeter scales. But we need to start thinking about microscale and nanoscale as well. Because the techniques that are out there, might use FTTD or some of the standard tools you would see in the industry, but the tools that have been developed at SIGGRAPH are just mind-blowing. We just have to make sure that they actually are applicable at these scales, because as you know, fluid simulation, fluid animation works very differently at nanoscopic or microscopic scales. So we need completely new math and completely new research to make that physically valid, biochemically valid, at the same time fast enough so that it can be used for optimization and simulation and design. My brother called me one day and he said he had a mild heart attack and the doctors are just suggesting a stent, in his 50s. And I said, sure. And we got his x-rays and I talked to some of my friends. And those of you who may have gone through this, a very stressful process of putting a stent after some kind of a cardiovascular condition, it's a pretty primitive process. You do a CT scan, you do angiography, and then the doctors make a guess of all the arteries, all the passages, where should you put the stent to make sure they stay open. But they still don't have tools to actually simulate how the hemodynamics, how the blood flow is going to go through the heart. And this would be a straightforward application of our existing tools, but of course, to make this interactive using virtual reality and make it very persuasive for the surgeons who are going to work on it as well as the patient who are going to spend a lot of money on it, would be fantastic to have tools for hemodynamics. And the same thing goes to one of the most lucrative industry, which is dental implants. And again, so you have pano CTs and you have optical 3D scanning. But those of you who have gone for any kind of dental procedure know that although the outer shape of your teeth can be scanned in 3D, when it comes to insertion of any metallic objects, like these implants, it's still done using trial and error. Imagine if you have volumetric scans to do that. Now, all the things I'm telling you about are nothing new. These have come through conversations to a lot of interesting people at various conferences, many of them with you and on our executive committee at SIGGRAPH. So many of these ideas are out there, and of course the challenge for us is how do we get these communities to come work with us, and how do we get our amazing researchers who are thinking very creatively to apply their energy to some of these efforts. So that remains unknown. Thinking about VR and AR, of course, it's not just about the visual input and output, but it's also about everything else you might be able to capture, your EOG, your EEG, your facial expressions, and so on. And that can be used in so many ways. And that's a very exciting space. One of the work we did last year at SIGGRAPH, 2015 at SIGGRAPH, was this notion of an eye selfie to again look at the dynamics of the blood flow in your retina, at the back of your eye. And it turns out most of your systemic conditions like diabetes and hypertension are a function of what's the blood flow, which is oxygenation and deoxygenation in your retina. Now, this is a classic problem for VR and AR because over time we can measure which part of your retina, which part of your eye is actually functional by showing the stimulus or playing a game, and create a map of which part of your eye is behaving with what efficiency. And that would allow us to do in a very closed loop with interactive techniques, solve not just VR and AR, but all these other health conditions. And we have this amazing paper on a CT method to measure the volume of a toy by slicing it. I forget the name of the authors. Fantastic, my favorite paper at SIGGRAPH this year. But imagine if you can take techniques like that, creativity like that, to start building CAT scan machine that will fit in a rickshaw. And that's possible as well. A few years ago, we showed a technique of how you can read through a book by going beyond visible spectrum and using terahertz. But the challenge in a lot of these methodologies, going beyond visible spectrum, is diffraction and interference and so on are not very well understood. Because again, the tools of the trade use optical path lengths and to measure interference. Again, some of the papers we're seeing this year on diffraction-based rendering, diffraction-based analysis would change these industries as well. And when it comes to connectomes, looking at the wirings of the brain reminds me of the Perlin noise, and Ken is sitting here. And it feels like the statistical property of how the brain is wired is so much more important than their geometrical structure. And so looking at it from a statistical point of view is something that our community understands really well. And I've had really great conversations with people in connectomes and what can be done in this space. And finally, about fabrics, right? The fabric industry spends a lot of time thinking about air circulation and convection and radiation of heat. And we need tools that not only deal with the fluid simulation of the circulation of heat, but also for radiative heat, which is looking at thermal wavelengths about 10 micrometers. We need to have simulation strategies. So rendering well beyond visible spectrum is within our reach, and that could change these industries. Now, why do we care about SIGGRAPH for these industries? I mean, the great thing about visual computing tools is that they're very insightful and they're very persuasive. It's not just a formula or not a spreadsheet that gets created in many of these other fields, but here we can create highly persuasive images that spark creativity and inspire the people to go and solve that problem, at the same time maintaining the mathematical rigor. So this is just a fantastic combination of the right set of techniques, the right set of visualizations, and possibilities of using them in impactful areas. So, for all of us, I feel like, as I said, we're in the third phase: the learning, the applying, and the impact, and all those things will continue in parallel. But how to bring all this energy back to SIGGRAPH, how to get all those communities to us, how can we get papers to come back to us is a big challenge, and we need your help doing that. I was in the executive committee for 3 years, and I know many of them on this committee, and earlier you heard the new kind of goal, enabling sharing of their stories in whatever way, whatever means possible is our goal. So, fortunately, our forefathers, our founding fathers for SIGGRAPH, chose the name of the conference as SIGGRAPH and not SIGGRAPHICS. And graph, of course, means draw, measure, record, view, connect in graph theory. So many weys to look at the charter we have been given by our founding fathers who named the conference SIGGRAPH. And as we go forward, I think we'll continue to see more and more impact through this field. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our final speaker is Jessica Hodgins. She's a professor at Carnegie Mellon, and she's our winner this year of the Stephen A. Coons Award. It was great to see the pictures of Helen Ferguson earlier on up there. The sculpture which she received this morning is actually designed and cast by Helen Ferguson, who's both a scientist and an artist. Jessica.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thank you all for this award. It's a tremendous honor to receive the Coons Award. I'd like to try and do two things with this talk. One is a call to action, and the other is a technical message. So let's start with the call to action. Okay, let's start with the call to action. So Ramesh set this up very nicely for me. Thank you. You heard Jeff this morning say that we were proposing a new 5-year vision for SIGGRAPH, enabling everyone to tell their stories. And I'd like to argue that we need to take a very broad definition of what we mean by everyone, the mechanisms that we use to tell, and also what we mean by stories. Okay. Told me there was one button not to push. I pushed it. So we'll try and see if we can do a little better here. So I think the field has done a very good job of supporting people who wanted to create animations, the modelers, the riggers, and people who create the amazing special effects that we enjoy in the movies. But I think we've done a slightly less good job of supporting individuals who have stories to tell, whether it's a child playing with her puppets, a woman growing up in Iran, or someone who's suffered traumatic brain injury and can no longer tell her stories in the way that she once could. There are many different kinds of stories that can be told. We all know the linear narrative arc. And we're now starting to talk and think about interactive stories, which are going to have much more complicated graphs, perhaps many different outcomes and complicated paths through that graph. I don't know whether this is going to end up being a compelling way to tell stories or not, but my call to action is I think that as a field we should be very aggressively exploring either this mechanism for telling stories or other similarly innovative and more complex methods. I think we want to use a very broad definition of story. Visualizations often tell stories. This tells the story of how the counties in Pennsylvania changed between 2 different presidential elections. And we also have physical artifacts that can tell stories, such as this 3D printed robot, and Bernd showed many nice examples of telling stories in that way. We have many different ways to tell stories. It can be the oral tradition, this father telling a story to his daughter in the context of her stuffed animal, theater, or animations and video. But we also want to think about new interactive ways to tell stories, either through interactive theater or through games and other kinds of interactive environments. The scene on the left is a representation of a show in New York, Sleep No More, which is a piece of interactive theater. It's been running very successfully for about 7 years. And they sync the audience into the background by having them put on masks, and then they're observing the actors as they go about their activities. And finally, we come to AR and VR, which is the current, one of the current hot topics, of course. And I think these are going to be very powerful ways to tell stories. But I also think that our community really needs to think about other mechanisms as well that go well beyond these kinds of immersive environments. And so I hope that that's what we see happen in the field over the next few years. So I want to switch gears now to the technical part of the talk. Much of my work has been focused on trying to put characters into these stories. We started by building controllers from first principles for simulations. We then discovered that that was actually really very difficult, and so we went to collecting data in order to get domain knowledge about the characters that we were trying to animate. And we've now moved to a third phase where we're using those controllers using the data to build those controllers. So this was 1995. The Olympics were in Atlanta in 1996. And so we were thinking about how to do very dynamic behaviors, athletic behaviors such as you see in the Olympics. And we were using a full body, rigid body model of a human. It was very complex. The simulations at that point in time took a long time to run. They now run many times faster than real time. Here's an example of okay. See, I want a video to be playing at this point. I don't know why it's not. Yeah, they're supposed to just trigger, but. Hmm? Let me grab my laptop. Off. Where do we go? All right, we'll try this again. Yes, okay, so we have an animation. So this was a running simulation that we did back then. And this was an example of some of Wayne Wooten's thesis work on diving. So where did these control laws come from? We had a full physical simulation, a rigid body simulation, and we needed to construct control laws that were going to figure out what to do with the joints in order to actually be able to perform those behaviors. So we got the ideas for doing these control laws from observation and from physical intuition. So we spent a lot of time looking at videotape of people performing these kinds of activities and tried to understand what it was they were doing as they performed them. And then we built very simple models, spring mass systems and inverted pendulums and so on. A tool that we knew about but didn't really have at our disposal at that point was optimization. At this point, you could make optimization work on very simple systems, such as a jumping Luxo lamp, but it wasn't possible yet to use it on full-body human models, which we can now do. So what did we learn from this? Well, control laws for human characters are very hard to design. There's no language for the stylistic subtleties of human motion, and our standards for human motion are very high, particularly when fully rendered. So absolutely everybody could tell me what was wrong with my simulations. They weren't always right about what was wrong with them, but they could tell me what was wrong with them. So everybody knows, everybody's an expert here. So we moved from that to trying to do motion capture and collect data about how people actually move and then use that to construct animations. So the first thing which my group and a number of others in the field did was to build motion graphs. So we took the raw motion data, connected up like poses, and then were able to search that graph in order to, for example, allow this character to walk across this rough terrain and to find the circle that had been drawn by the user as a goal. We learned from this that databases don't need to be nearly as big as we would have guessed. About 5 minutes is sufficient for walking. and planning in the space of possible behaviors as represented by the data is actually quite efficient. Alla Safanova went on to build on this work in her thesis on interpolated motion graphs, and so the idea here was to essentially have a graph that allowed two paths to be operating and interpolated at the same time, and this allowed the satisfaction of more constraints. So jumping across the stepping stones, ducking under the bar, and sitting on the chair was a very complicated set of constraints this character had to satisfy. There's another important observation from her thesis, which is that optimality of human motion is actually really important for the naturalness of it. So she was using an anytime A-star search algorithm, which produced many solutions along the way. And if we look at the final pose here of this character in the suboptimal solutions, she's in kind of an awkward position, whereas the optimal solution looks like the way you would probably try to solve this problem. And this is just another of her examples. I like this one because the character steps when the poles are close to each other, but hops or jumps when they're further away, and that's what's necessary to accomplish the task. And that just falls out of having all this natural human motion data. This is a recent example of some work where we have an original motion capture sequence on the left. We've annotated it for who's listening and who's talking at each moment in time. And then we're using those as events to synthesize the new one, which is over on the right-hand side. So the motions are quite different that the characters do, but they seem appropriate for the periods of time when they're listening and the periods of time when they're talking. So what did we learn from this work on motion graphs and subsequent projects to build on that? Well, one lesson is that optimality is actually very important for the appearance of natural-looking motion. And I think going forward, we still need to understand what's going to replace contact events and optimality for more stylistic and less dynamic motions. And we're also going to need new evaluation techniques for stylistic motions, such as the last examples that I showed you. So I'm now moving to the third part, where we're now trying to take data and use it to construct control systems. And Tai-Soo Kwon will be presenting a paper toward the end of the week where we did this. We took motion capture data and extracted an inverted pendulum model from it, a particular style of inverted pendulum model, which he calls momentum mapped, and used that then to control a character. So we figure out at each moment in time what the pendulum ought to be doing. We can map down to the pendulum from the current state of the character and back up to the full character from the pendulum model. We also add an optimization process at as a pre-processing step to adapt the control system so that it's a little bit more robust for some of the behaviors. And here are a few examples of those behaviors. So this is captured motion when she's wearing the purple shirt. Yellow is the simulated motion here for a handstand. And here's a round off. And one more, a papa jump. That's the captured motion, and again, the simulated motion with the control system. And the final piece of work I wanted to talk about was learning motion controllers. And this was presented by Li Bin Liu this morning. And his insight is that we can take very small control fragments, 0.1 seconds in time long, and then resequence them, learning how to do that through a deep learning method, Q-networks, so that we can figure out which control fragment ought to be employed at every moment in time. And that allows him to produce these kinds of behaviors. It's important to note that she can touch the board on the ground and still recover from that, so it's not just a balancing task, but the contact conditions are changing along the way. And here with the skateboard example, the arrow is telling her what direction to turn in. She can push off again up against the ground, so again changing the contact conditions. So what did we learn from this? Well, priors about human motion are very effective in reducing the search or optimization space, and they can come either in the form of raw data or models. And physics is a very effective constraint, particularly for contacts. And then finally, the message again of optimality pushing human motion toward naturalness. Now, I believe that none of these three, priors, physics, or optimality, are sufficient alone, and other constraints or models will likely be needed, especially for more stylistic motions where the physics doesn't tell us as much about the behavior. Another observation, and this is one that I wouldn't have predicted, but animation is now contributing to robotics and to psychophysics or motor psychology. Originally, when I started in the field, I came from robotics, and we were taking a lot of learnings from robotics and applying them in animation, and now I think we've made a transition and things are actually going in the other direction. The other observation I wanted to close with is that very soon we're going to be able to record essentially everything, and we need to be thinking hard about what techniques we're going to use to manage those vast quantities of data. There were a couple of papers presented at CVPR last week in Hawaii where people are doing a very good job of capture from cameras in the environment and being able to get what people are doing with a great deal of accuracy. So once we have those sources of data, it's not going to be just what I can record in my motion capture lab anymore, and we're going to have to understand how to use those quantities of data. So to close, I'd like to thank one more time the great groups that I have worked with over the years, the CMU and MIT Leg Lab, the Georgia Tech Animation Lab, the Carnegie Mellon Graphics Lab, and Disney Research. Thank you.
Jessica and all of the award winners, thank all of you for coming to this award session, which is now done. There will be awards again next year and the year after. Hopefully all of you aspire to become award winners. In the meantime, please send to awards@siggraph.org your nominations for awardees for next year, and we'll see you next year. Thank you.